Hello, I'm Scott Brady, and welcome to the Overland Journal podcast. I'm out here with my longtime friend and business partner, Brian McVickers, and we are sailing across the Northern Pacific to the Bering Sea on the Kailani. This is a 52-foot sailboat made by Island Packet, and we are aiming right now for a pass next to Oceanic Island in the Aleutians, so that we can make safe passage into the Bering Sea. And we're going to do just our little intro here because we're going to bring it back to the studio for the in-depth conversation. As you can see, we're both busy at the moment doing sailing stuff, so we will talk to you in the office. And Brian, thanks for being on the podcast, man.
Scott, happy to be here.
Hello and welcome to the Overland Journal podcast. I am your host, Scott Brady. And my co-host, Matt Scott, is not with us today because he is bouncing around somewhere in Zanzibar, I believe, today on his honeymoon. Congratulations, Matt. Really excited for Laura and you. And I have a special guest today in our studio, Brian McVickers. We just did a little introduction of him and our expedition with the Kailani Expedition in the intro feed that we recorded on the boat. But now we're back in the studio. And we're going to talk through expedition sailing. We're going to talk a little bit about your life and the things that have trained you to not only be our Chief Business Development Officer, but an expedition sailor and certainly an overlander in your own right. I think that they all come together in a very interesting story that I believe that our listeners will really enjoy.
Thanks, Scott. I appreciate being on the podcast. It's get to see it happen every week, and it's kind of fun to be on behind the microphone. So, yeah.
No, it's super fun to have you here. And it's also so rewarding for me that the team of people that we've worked so hard to assemble at Overland International, we're all adventurers, we're all travelers, and we've all got these great stories to tell. So it is fun to have our own team members on the show as well and talk about these very interesting topics like expedition sailing, for example, today.
Yeah, I remember, 15 years ago, when we all first came together to create what we've done, I remember that we all brought some different sense of adventure with us. I think that sense of travel and exploration we all had in common regardless of our other backgrounds.
Yeah, we certainly did. And Expedition Portal had started, but I had this crazy idea of a magazine with Jonathan Hansen, and I called you up and I said, "Hey, can you meet us in North Phoenix for some sushi?"
At the sushi restaurant, yeah, sushi
right.
broker.
That's right. And you had some experience, quite a bit of experience in marketing and advertising in other areas of the outdoor space, but you had not done the overland thing because the overland thing wasn't much of a thing at the time. There wasn't really much of a industry. But we sat down and we had this conversation, and I think I was mid-sentence, and you're like, "I'm in." So.
Yeah, it wasn't a hard decision by any means. And I remember that, I had just come off of several years exploring by sailboat. And when we came back to land, I still wanted to explore. And that's how I got into overlanding. And I remember, buying an old, Land Rover Discovery 2. And
you did, yeah. You had the one reliable 2001
It was
Discovery
a great
2.
truck. I had that for 8 years before it started to degrade.
It was so reliable.
And I remember getting into the overlanding thing and using it for traveling. We really enjoyed that. But I've always had, coming from a background of being an athlete and being competitive and then competitive sailboat racing, I had this great truck, and I was like, so how can I compete with it? What can I do? And that's when you were doing the Expedition Trophy.
That's right. I remember that.
And that's one of the first times we met was at an Expedition Trophy, and we were all having fun being a little competitive with our trucks.
Well, and I actually think the very first time that we met was in a Fry's parking lot, and you were actually buying my grandfather's welder from me. It was like this giant stick welder.
The Lincoln Tombstone, the red box.
Right? It wasn't. And you had only one of your two kids at the time, and they were in the little car seat in the back. So yeah, it has been a long time.
Yeah.
And so fun that we can take this journey together. And then more recently, we took a very serious journey. And why don't you share with the listener what we did?
Yeah, sure. So very recently, we set sail in June, mid-June, I think June 17th or June 19th. We left from Long Beach, California, San Pedro area, and we crossed the Pacific Ocean on a 50-foot island packet. We sailed up to the Bering Sea, and so that was a pretty momentous kind of expedition in many ways. So I have a good friend, Rusty Franz, and he bought this island packet back in 2014, and I helped him sail it down the West Coast. So we brought it from Portland down to San Diego. And Rusty's a lifelong friend. I met him in St. Petersburg, Florida, back in 2000 when we were both preparing our boats to go cruise the Caribbean. Independently of one another. We just happened to meet on the dock. And
that's amazing.
So, a number of years later, he says, hey, I bought this new boat and help me out with it. So we sailed it down the West Coast. And then last fall, as we're all kind of sitting around, dealing with 2020, he calls up and he said, hey, let's sail to Hawaii. And I said, yeah, that's a cool idea. And, because it's a great sail. I've never done it, but it's, about a 3-week sail. It's a bit of a sleigh ride. You've got the wind behind you and it's not terribly difficult. So I said, well, what are we going to do when we get there? And he said, well, maybe we'll go up to Seattle. I said, well, if we're going to go to Seattle, why don't we go to Alaska and then prepare to do the Northwest Passage up over Canada and go to Greenland. And he said, no, that's crazy. We're not doing that. And this was an 11 o'clock at night conversation.
Sure.
And about 5:30 the next morning, I just get this text, and he says, okay, we're doing the Northwest Passage. and he's the kind of guy that it's all or none. So it's full throttle. And so ever since then, we just started, creating this plan. Then Canada just didn't open up for travelers. So Canada, for 2021, for the first half at least, they weren't permitting anybody to come into the Canadian waters.
Sure.
So we couldn't do the Northwest Passage. We decided, well, we still have the time allocated, and let's come up with another idea. Let's go explore the Aleutian Islands up in Alaska. Nobody goes there.
Sure.
And when we were there, nobody was there. And it's this really historic and beautiful area of the world to go explore. And so to get there, you've got to cross the Pacific, and that's when, I knew that you have always wanted to do a sailing expedition of some sort.
For
and
sure.
You and I have done so many land-based overlanding expeditions together. I just thought it was a great opportunity for us all to go do something really amazing.
Well, and when you first asked me, of course, I was completely honored, but I'm in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, what can I possibly contribute to this endeavor? Because I had done a week of sailing and gotten a bareboat license, so you could basically rent a sailboat and hopefully not run into something. So, and that was in 2012. So before I even started Expedition 7, and then I didn't touch another sailboat until we stepped on to Kailani in Long Beach. So I had knew less than nothing.
You knew very little about sailing
when we started.
Yeah. But I remember talking with you about this, and it's like a lot of expeditions where the expertise in the physical, driving the vehicle or sailing the boat, you definitely need that. But as we've experienced before, what can really make or break an expedition or a big trip like that is the people involved. So it comes down to personalities, demeanor. Can you keep your cool in adverse situations? And you're well proven in that. So the lack of sailing experience was the least of any concern. Besides, you got medical experience. You can work on a diesel engine. You're very mechanically inclined, and the rest of it you pick up along the way pretty quickly.
Well, and it was literally being thrown into the deep end, literally the deep end.
It was.
And that's what I love about endeavors like this is you start into them with an idea of what it's going to be like. Again, this is when you know nothing. When you know nothing, you start into it with an idea of what it's going to be like, and it could have been 1,000 different ways, and we got one of the easier ways, but it was still completely different than what I expected it to be. So I think it would be interesting to talk about the fact that you started under scholastics, academic opportunities for sailing for you when you were in college. So you're racing for the college. What did you learn from that then you moved on to cruising with now your wife, Amy?
Sure. It started a little bit earlier than that. When I was 12 years old, my parents signed me up for sailing camp in the summer. And we lived just outside of Chicago in a little town called LaGrange. And I would take the train into the city every morning. I had my duffel bag, and I'm sitting there on the train with all the business suits, right? And I'd get into the city, and I'd go down to Columbia Yacht Club, and I'd spend my days learning how to sail. And that quickly turned into racing, because the little yacht club had a junior racing team. And we would race the other yacht clubs up and down the coast of Lake Michigan. And so I did that through, from starting at 12 years old into high school. When I was in high school, I was more involved with the racing team. We would start to travel around the country. I started our Lyons Township High School sailing team,
nice.
Which had one member, which was me. And I remember the principal gave me $65 to enter a regatta. That's awesome. That was my sponsorship as a high school sailor.
And what kind of boat were you sailing at that time?
So we were racing sunfish, lasers, 420s, FJs, things like that. So small, single and double-handed sailing boats. And then as I got into high school, my stepfather invited me to sail or race on our family boat, which was a 33-foot Tartan 10. So it's a one design racing. It means all the boats are identical to one another. And then they operate under some, they call them, kind of class rules. So nobody can put too much money into their boat and make it too much more advantageous than the next boat. So you're limited year to year what you can do to the boat. And so it was great racing to learn, tactics and strategy and really the fundamentals of racing sailboats, because everybody was racing the exact same racing boat.
What a great way to do that.
Yeah.
It levels the playing field.
It's one of my favorite ways to race is with one design. It's kind of really the only way to do it. I love it. And so then getting later into high school, it's time for college, and I started to apply to colleges that had racing teams. So I got into Old Dominion University as well as a couple others, but they had asked me to come and also be on the racing team. So for college, I raced with Old Dominion. It's in Norfolk, Virginia.
Wow.
And there it was, pretty much year round. We would practice from 3 o'clock to 6 o'clock every day. And then we had regattas on the weekend. So we would travel up and down the East Coast, racing other colleges.
And what boat was that for those races?
So for those, we did lasers, FJs. We did, those were the primary two boats. So lasers and FJs. And then every year they would have a larger regatta or a larger series where we'd do small keel boats. So we would often do like J22s, J24s.
Yeah, I've seen some of those come up advertised for sale, and they have a pretty long keel.
They do.
With the weight concentrated very low down on that keel.
They do, yeah. J boats have been kind of a classic racing boat, and the J24 class especially is very popular. And then the J22s is just a little bit smaller, and that's a popular class as well. So. And
then somehow along the way, you bump into Amy, who's now your wife, and you guys hatch a plan to go sail for years around the Caribbean. So, how did you go from bumping into each other to heading off on what is an amazing adventure, especially at that age?
Yeah, sure. So my college summers were spent teaching sailing. So there's a yacht club called the Waukegan Yacht Club, and for 3 or 4 years I was a lead instructor there, and so I headed up their program. And so that got me into teaching sailing and then coaching racing. And then after college, I started teaching adult classes at Columbia Yacht Club. And so I remember it pretty vividly to this day. And so I was working for CNN and Turner Broadcasting at the time. I get done with work, and I'm in a suit, suit and tie. And I get up in front of the class at the yacht club, and I look out, and there's this tall redhead in the class. Uh-huh. And that's pretty much, end of the story. It's the beginning and the end of the story right there. And so we became. So
she was your student.
Yeah, she was a student in the class, right. And so we got to be great friends. And then we brought her on to our racing boat for training, and because we'd get a bunch of the keel boats, the big boats in the yacht club, to help take the adult class out for Wednesday night beer can races and some of the races on the weekends. And so we had befriended Amy, and she came on our boat, and then it kind of the end of the story. And we were good buddies, just good friends for about a year and a half before we even started, officially dating.
Sure. Such a great story.
Yeah. And it just, love her to death. And it was just amazing. And we get along so well. And so, fast forward a little bit to around 2000, and just back up a little bit before that, probably 1998, 1999, we went to France, and we chartered an Oceanic 55, I think.
Nice boat.
Beautiful boat, absolutely gorgeous boat, and we circumnavigated Corsica, and so that must have been 2000. No, that was 1999, because the entire time I had this engagement ring with me the entire time, and so I proposed to her on Corsica there's a 10,000 foot peak there called Bavola, and
so great.
So we went up there, and so that was part of our story, because the significant part of that story is that's the first time we really saw people living on sailboats. And up to this point, I just raced them. I raced sailboats, and we saw cruisers on their cruising boats, and you just kind of like, that's not really sailing,
sure.
So it's all about racing. And so, that's the first time we met people who were living on their boat and exploring the world by sailboat. And we just fell in love with the idea. We thought it was great. And so we went back to Chicago, and we were trying to decide what we're going to do when we get married. Do you move out to the suburbs? Do you get a condo in the city? Do you start a family right away? And our solution was to sell everything that we had, buy a sailboat, live on the sailboat, and then go travel.
And figure it out.
And figure it out along the way. And so we bought an Allied Princess 2, which is a 36-foot stay-sail catch. And we bought that in St. Petersburg, Florida, moved down to Florida. We lived on the boat for 2 years, saving every penny we could. And then we took off, and we went down to the Caribbean.
How was that, living on a sailboat for 2 years in a marina? I mean, I think I'm probably speaking for some of the audience at least, but I know I'm speaking for myself, that there's this very romantic idea of, if you think about the cost of real estate in Southern California, for example,
sure.
or Seattle, and you look at a slip that may be $1,800 or $2,200 a month, and you realize you're on the water in usually one of the better places of Southern California or wherever you're at, and living on the sailboat. So it to me, it sounds very appealing. How was it to actually do it?
Yeah, it's a great point. It does. It's supposed to feel really romantic, right? It was kind of like living in a trailer park.
Sure. Was that the Florida part, or
yeah, that only made it worse, right? And so it was interesting. And that's part of the reason we wound up going to the Caribbean is so we got into, economically it was great. We were paying $450 or $500 a month for our boat payment. And then we were paying, I think, $300 a month for the marina fee to live aboard in the marina for a slip and
sure.
all the amenities. So economically, it was less than we were paying for an apartment in Chicago. So that helped us to save more money. And we were working our regular jobs. And so after a while, we had come up with this idea of doing a circumnavigation, and we had planned it out. We were planning out the route.
Circumnavigating the planet.
The planet.
Cool.
So that was the original goal, is to circumnavigate the globe. And what we found is we could never get to a point like of having enough money where we felt like we would be doing that responsibly. And so we were waiting and saving and trying, and then the other thing we noticed is there were a lot of people. I think that marinas, especially liveaboard marinas down in Florida, it's kind of like where sailing dreams go to die, because there's a lot of people who they're working on their boats and they've got these stories about what they're going to go do, but it's never the right time. There's always another project that their boat's not quite ready to go yet.
Sure.
And so they'll say, hey, there's down in Florida, when you're especially trying to leave those waters, you really watch the weather. There's a lot of weather windows, which you watch anywhere, but down there with the hurricane seasons and everything. So we're always watching the weather windows, and they would come and go. And there was always another project that and so eventually we woke up one morning and we kind of looked at each other and said, we either need to leave or we need to find another idea, like sell the boat, move on with life. But so we decided, okay, we're just gonna leave, and we left with no plan except we were going to go south. And we had really detailed plans to circumnavigate, but no plan to just leave. So within, I think, a week of making that decision, we were gone. And I remember getting into, I think we were in Marathon Key, which is down in the Florida Keys. And it's a very common jumping off point to cross the Gulf Stream. And we were sitting in the bar waiting for the weather window. And there was this family there who was going down to the Caribbean, and they had every detail of their Caribbean experience planned out. They knew exactly where they were going to go. They had the maps. They had the anchorages laid out. They had everything covered. And they looked over at us and they said, what are you guys doing? We said, well, we're going to go south. And that was our plan. And so we just figured it out along the way, because it wasn't part of the original plan, but we decided, we're going to make an adventure of it. And so we did. We went and got lost in the Caribbean for 2 years.
Yeah,
and
amazing.
It was an incredible experience in traveling, in meeting other people, in being self-sufficient. I think we left Florida with 2 months worth of food on the boat. And that lasted us quite a long time. And
I'm going to unpack this whole statement that you made about 30 seconds ago, because we always hear people on this podcast, I've said it, is just to go.
Yeah.
And you're actually one of the few people, Amy and you are actually one of the few people that just woke up one day and decided that the path that you were on was not working and we're just going to go. And you actually did it. You actually, within, sounds like 7 days, you were gone.
Yeah. And we had already made all these plans to be leaving, but we just couldn't quite get there. And, I think part of it, we had planned the circumnavigating part out so much, and that became the goal. And I think we were overthinking it. So we were overthinking it. We were, probably over preparing the boat. We were probably over saving. Where we were probably thinking we need to have so much money to be able to go do that. And when now I meet people who have sailed the globe or driven the globe overland, and they work along the way. They figure out a way to make it work financially.
You just go do it.
Now today, doing it, I think about it often, especially with a lot of the people that we work with Expedition Portal and Overland Journal. We have contributors that are out traveling the world, and they're able to do that and sustain financially by writing and photography. And 20 years ago, that wasn't a thing.
It wasn't even a possibility.
Yeah, you didn't have connectivity like that.
And I think that if I look even at the best trips I've ever had are the ones that I was underprepared for oftentimes. And the trips that I'm overprepared for, the outcomes are usually very much what I expected. And that can be a good thing, especially if you're trying to do a production or you're really trying to get to some place or your goals are not about the adventure. Your goals are about arriving someplace, like maybe crossing a very dangerous area. But I think that when a little bit of serendipity happens is when you really do find the true joys of travel. So that brings me to the question of, what did you learn from that process of letting go and then just going that you've then since applied to your travels after that point?
Sure. I think, one of the biggest things we learned was, you don't need all the stuff that you think you need. And I think by the time that we realized that, we were really set up. We had really gone through the boat. We'd never had any issues with the boat, in the entire trip while we were living on it and while we were sailing it down in the Caribbean. We never ran into an issue, but part of that is the way that we prepared it. But what we found that we got to this point where we had already prepared the boat well, and now we were just adding gadgets, right? And once we realized that we don't need the gadgets, some of them are cool and they make it better, but we weren't even putting on the latest and greatest gadgets. We were kind of putting on what we could afford, but just kind of going. So the boat was reliable, so we were never really worried about the breakdown and the bad things happening to the boat. But I think when we started going, it was the places we were going to go. And then after the fact, what I found was we didn't know where we were going. And so the places that we missed out on were all the kind of the touristy places where everybody was going. And then we realized we were really fine with that.
Yeah, totally.
So we went off the beaten path a little bit. We missed out on a couple of maybe highlights, but I think I missed out on the pigs swimming off of whatever beach that they're on down there. But that's a total tourist thing anyway.
Totally,
right?
It totally is.
That's where all the cruisers go.
Yeah.
And I didn't get to see that, and I'm okay with it, and because we got to see the island that I can't remember the name of it, but it was completely deserted, and nobody went there. And you'd walk up on land, and we would walk across the island because it wasn't very big. But when you were walking, everything was, to put it in a picture, it kind of looks like a little rainforest, right? The terrain. And when you're walking, it's dead silent. And then if you stop and just stand still, the ground would come to life with snakes and crabs.
Amazing.
And they would be skittering all over. There are thousands of them. But then as soon as you took a step, they all stopped. And then because
it was an untouched place.
Untouched, nobody went there. That type of thing was amazing.
One of the stories that I remember you telling me that most fascinated me was you guys were trying to be very careful with your finances because you wanted to stay out as long as possible. And if I get the details wrong, just correct me. But I think I remember you telling me that at one point you got to where you really only needed about $120 to $130 a month on the boat. And then what you would do to get, and that was for like rice and beans and some diesel. And then you would just fish or spearfish how low did you really get your expenses?
Yeah. So our least expensive month was $150. And now to put that into perspective, we were still paying we still had a boat payment, call it $500. We still had an insurance payment on the boat, right? So if you look at those those are expenses that they're there. You can't do anything about them.
What was the insurance? Do you remember?
It was boat insurance.
No, what was the cost on the insurance approximately?
I bet the insurance was maybe $150 a month.
Okay.
Maybe, yeah, it wasn't much.
So if you owned the boat, you probably could get down to $300 to $500 a month.
Yeah. Now that's if you're in a place where you can productively fish, and productively maybe even live off the land. Because we would, that $150, that would go towards some of the groceries if we went to an island and we'd get a couple staples here and there. But, you get a 40-pound bag of rice and you fish every day And so
incredible.
We would fish from the boat, we would fish from the dinghy, and then we would spearfish. So we would free dive, and we had a pole spear, which is just it's like an 8-foot fiberglass stick with a spear tip on the end and a rubber band on the other end. And the range wasn't really good. You had to get really close to the fish. But then other people would use like a Bahamian spear, which is more like it's like a wooden dowel with a rubber band on it, and then you can let the spear go, and it'll actually go out further, maybe 15, 20 feet. Where this thing you had to be within 10 feet. But we would get, we'd harvest all sorts of fish, lobster, conch, and it was funny because the first time I ever tried to harvest a conch, it probably took me 2 hours trying to break into this thing, and I couldn't figure it out. And I was, destroyed the poor shell just trying to get the conch out. And then, I met some local fishermen, and they taught me how to do it in under a minute.
So what's the trick?
So you count the rings on the shell, so that's the spiral part of the shell, and you get a good knife, and I think it's the second or third ring down, and you take the back side of the knife, the dull part of the knife, and you smack the shell like you're using the knife as a hammer, and you basically chip a little hole in the shell right at that ring that's big enough to get the knife into. And then you flip the knife around and you stick the blade in and you just rub it back and forth a couple of times, and it cuts the muscle.
Sure.
And now the conch doesn't have anything to hold on to anymore,
sure.
Right? And so then you go around the other side and you grab the foot, and the foot of the conch is it's almost like a hard shell in itself.
Okay.
So you grab the foot, and then you just pull, and this crazy looking creature comes out. So I got pretty good at it.
And then how do you cook that?
So they're really tough.
Okay.
So you need to tenderize them.
All right.
And so they've got like the muscle itself, which is the animal. It has this weird skin on it. So you slice it, and then the skin peels right off. And then you take you're left with this big piece of meat that kind of looks like a chicken breast. And you just...
It tastes like chicken?
No, it doesn't. It tastes like conch. I don't know. and you can prepare it 100 different ways.
Wow.
But you've got to really beat the heck out of it.
You got to work on it.
You got to tenderize it in order to really get it to taste good. But we would eat it all. We ate it all the time.
So beyond the fishing and these basic staples, what did you typically fill your days with for 2 years of traveling around the Caribbean?
Yeah. So if you're making passage, if you're making a passage between islands, or from, for longer distances, you're really focused on sailing. And when you're sailing like that, you're really focusing on, getting the boat to go as fast as you can, for the conditions. But I say that in a different way too, because racing a sailboat, you're really trying to go as fast as you can, and you're pushing the systems, you're pushing the boat as hard as you can. When you're cruising and exploring and living aboard, that boat becomes your everything.
Your home.
And so that preservation becomes a priority as well. So you're trying to sail fast, but you're trying to, have some mechanical sympathy on the entire system, because it has to last you for a long, long time. And so you're focusing on sailing, you're focusing on navigation. We didn't have a really whiz-bang electronic navigation system. I think we didn't have a chart plotter. So we had a nice GPS system, but we used paper charts. And we would take a reading every hour. And so when we were underway, we would take a reading every hour. And so we would do the good old map and compass, and, your parallel rules, and you just kind of plot it right there on the map. And we still have all the charts.
So cool.
Which is really fun. I kept them. And so then you're planning out your anchorage, you're planning out where to go. And then once you get to an island, or wherever you're going to make landfall, you'd go and explore. And so we'd do a lot of hiking. We would do a lot of just kind of going into the small towns and spending time and kind of getting to know the locals. Because we would go someplace and we would spend 2 to 4 weeks someplace. And so after a week, the locals start to look at you like, well, you're not going anywhere. And so they start to befriend you a little bit more. And then after 2-3 weeks, you're walking through town and you know everybody's name. And you kind of you're still a visitor, but you're a little bit more a part of the community. So I think you're no longer a tourist, and you're a little bit more of a traveler.
Sure. And that's always the goal.
It is. And we really enjoyed that aspect of it. But there were days where we would wake up in the morning and you'd kind of say, well, what do you want for lunch? And we'd get in the dinghy and we'd go fish and spearfish and get lunch and dinner. And then that was your thing,
Yeah, amazing. So, and then just that amount of quality time together with your wife, I mean, it just had to have formed an inseparable bond. Either it was going to be something that you got done with the trip and you realize I don't really want to be with this person, or you realize that, yeah, this is the person I want to be with for the rest of my life.
Absolutely. It was a 36-foot sailboat, which, living space that probably turned it into a 20-foot tube. And so it's not a lot of living space.
Yeah, Connex box, basically.
Yeah, it's like living in a Connex. It's a luxurious Connex, but
what was the
amount of space.
What was the beam on it?
I think so. It's 36 foot long. I think that had a 12-foot beam.
Okay. Yeah, so a little bit wider than a Connex box.
Yeah, so you go down below, and there was a nice couch on either side, and then a V berth, which is like a master stateroom up in the front, literally shaped like a V. And so that's where we would primarily sleep, in the V berth, and that was our bedroom. And we had there was a chest of drawers built into the boat, and a nice closet, and a nice bathroom. And but you knew everything about each other pretty quickly.
Yeah. That's so amazing.
Yeah, it was great.
Now, talking specifically about cruising in that area, what was the most challenging thing that happened for Amy and you during that trip? And then also, what was the thing that you took away as the most endearing, like your favorite moment? So what was your most challenging moment? What was your most favorite moment from that cruising
Yeah, those are good questions. I try not to think about it too much in the sense of time, but I think some of the weather could get pretty challenging. We had a few instances where the weather was pretty rough. We had one storm that knocked us down. We had a full knockdown where that puts the spreader. So the spreader tip went into the water. And so, a keel boat, most of the time they're going to pop back up. And it did. We recovered from it pretty quickly. We got knocked down, we rounded up, and, it was over in an instant. But while it was happening, it was in slow motion.
Yeah, terrifying.
And it was pretty good. I mean, when you race dinghies, that happens all the time.
Sure.
Right. So you're used to the boat either capsizing or near capsizing, and you're used to that movement of the boat. It usually doesn't happen with a big keel boat. So when it did, my instincts went right back to racing dinghies, and we rounded up and we popped out of it and we kept on sailing. But, while it was happening, it was probably more terrifying 5 minutes after it had happened.
Right.
Because you realize what just happened.
You evaded a serious situation.
When it was happening, you're just like, oh,
this is what I'm going to do.
Here's how you get out of it, right?
So when you say rounding up, you just like spun the wheel basically to get the boat to turn.
Yeah, you head up into the wind.
Got it.
And luckily, the spreader went into the water. The sail never went into the water. The sail touched the water. But what can really happen to make that a really dangerous situation is if the mainsail was to go far enough into the water that now it's scooping water, because now it becomes a big water weight.
Sure.
And then it's going to hold you down. And then if it holds you down, now you're going to have water start to come into the boat. It's going to come in, and then if the water gets up over the hatchway and goes down below, then that's really, really bad.
Yeah.
But we were able to, we blew the main sheet, let it out all the way, headed up into the wind, and popped right out of it. So it was very eventful, but it was resolved pretty quickly.
Yeah, and you told me another story about waking up in the morning and stepping into a foot or so of water in the bottom of the boat.
Oh yeah, we almost sank twice.
So the rounding up was the worst one, and the two near sinkings were incidental.
Yeah, the two near sinkings were incidental. One near sinking, we were underway, and it was absolutely gorgeous day, and we were on port tack. We were on a nice broad reach, and I think we were doing 8.5 knots, and we were just ripping along for that boat. It was fast, and just everything was perfect. And when we were underway like that, we always had our alarm set for 20 minutes. Every 20 minutes, we would check gauges, look around the boat, check for any problems, and you got into such a rhythm of it that it was good to maintain and prevent bad things from happening. This was such a beautiful day that I think we actually started to fall asleep in the cockpit while we're just ripping along. It was gorgeous. And so then one of us got, wanted some drink of water or something. And we went downstairs and we stepped into, near, probably shin deep water.
Whoa.
And we're like, oh, we got a problem. So we turned on all the bilge pumps and got the water evacuated pretty quickly in under 5 minutes. And then, because I think we had 3 or 4 bilge pumps on that boat. Redundancy in bilge pumps for sailboats is a great idea. And we even had we had a bilge pump built into the engine where we had a lever that you could convert the raw water intake from the engine or for the engine.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. So instead of pulling from the ocean to cool the engine, you're pulling from the bilge.
That's brilliant.
Your engine just became a huge bilge pump.
That's brilliant. So you use the water pump of the engine
to evacuate the bilge.
That's amazing.
Yeah, and that really makes it fast because that's a lot of horsepower behind a bilge pump. And so you throw that over, and then you've got to monitor it and put it back to raw water, before you go dry on the bilge. But so that was a great fail-safe for us. And then we just started looking for where the water's coming from, and it turned out that it was just it was actually coming from a bilge pump hose. It was, looped way up to be an anti-siphon, but the heel of the boat and the angle of everything kind of worked out perfectly to actually put that anti-siphon loop underwater while we were sailing at that particular, all those situations. And so the water just came right back in through the bilge pump. And then I think after that, I installed check valves and everything. We didn't have them on that.
So like a one-way valve.
A one-way valve, yeah.
That makes sense.
So that's how you figure that out.
So then what was that, maybe it was also that magical moment too of sailing that way, but when you think back on all of that time and the time on the islands and with the locals and everything else, what's the one thing that Amy and you look back on of like that was literally magic?
I think it was the opportunity to meet and spend time with people. People that we normally wouldn't get to experience in, say your regular day-to-day life, right? And so we found the people that lived in the Caribbean to be gracious and, very hospitable and welcoming. It gave us a lot of appreciation for a lot of the things that you're coming from Chicago as a big city and everything's at your fingertips. And now you're in an environment where you're meeting people who live in the Caribbean full time. And again, it was 20 years ago, so it was a different place. And, they waited for the mailboat to come around once a week, and they were very self-sufficient. And, the mailboat was also the supply boat. And then they were, they kind of subsist on fishing. And then they get hit with hurricanes once a year. Sure. So.
And shockingly, they are all a lot happier, it seems like, than the people in a big city.
Yeah. There was a lot of comparison to that in many ways. So, that was one of the things we really enjoyed, is just to get to meet different people from around the world. And you'd meet people who they had sailed over from Europe and they had done an Atlantic crossing, or they had been out just circumnavigating, and they're true travelers. And then you'd also meet the people who were down there on vacation and they had chartered a boat for a week.
Sure.
And the people that did that, they were approaching their experience completely differently.
Right. They were much more on the schedule, and
they were on the schedule. They had their list of experiences that they wanted, and they were kind of expecting all those experiences, and they're kind of going down the checklist and moving, at 100 miles an hour, where we were just, kind of day to day, you'd take what you got and, experience it that way.
Sure. So bringing kind of this idea of cruising full circle back to overland travel, which is something that you've also done a lot of, what comparisons would you draw between sailboat cruising and overlanding? And also, what things did you learn in sailboat cruising that you think really translated well to overland travel, that really actually prepared you to do well in a vehicle as well?
Yeah, I think, one of the main comparisons that I've always made to, vehicle-based overlanding and vehicle-based adventure to exploring by boat, whether it's a sailboat or a motorboat, is I think in some ways overlanding is easier when it comes to a preparation and dealing with adverse situations. And part of the reason is, let's say you get a flat tire in your truck. You can stop, you can get out, you can walk around, you can allow your environment to stop, it's what we used to say, brew a cup of tea,
sure,
and then deal with the problem. And then as you had just experienced, crossing the Pacific, there's no stopping.
There's no stopping.
There's no getting out of the car.
No.
You're
if the car catches on fire, you can run away from it. If the boat catches on fire,
yeah, you're swimming in the middle of the ocean.
Yeah, it's a problem.
So it's a completely different environment. And so you're surrounded by water. You can't just step off, take a walk. You can't, the boat is in constant motion. Even if you were to heave to, which, is a way of kind of putting a sailboat into a safety position where it's kind of like hitting pause. But even going into safety position and going and heaving to, you're still moving and you're still dealing with that type of an environment. And so when, dealing with adverse situations on a boat, whether it be on a racing boat or a cruising boat, when I got to overlanding and bad stuff happens, I'm like, well, this is easy.
Yeah.
Right. Because I know that, I'm likely not going to die. Whereas on a boat, I'm like, well, there's more of a chance I'm going to die.
Sure.
And so,
well, and also we're land-based humans,
Yeah.
right? I mean, we're designed, we're made to operate on the land, and in the water, we're very much a fish out of water. And because of that, it even when we stopped in the middle of the Pacific during the crossing, and we were completely becalmed, and the Pacific was this giant swimming pool, and we decided to all jump off the boat. And I remember I jumped into the Pacific. Actually, it was probably the second or third time that I jumped in, but I decided to really dive in. So I dove as deep as I could get, and the boat's far off the water, so it was a pretty. And
Sure.
I was up on the lifeline rail, and I jumped in probably 10 feet above the water or so. And I remember diving in and plunging, and within moments, I went from this very warm, very pool-like surface to it getting rapidly colder, and seeing all of the light rays kind of descending down into the depths of this blackness, this transition from this light, very turquoise blue to this darker blue to total darkness down below me. I realized very quickly that I don't belong. I don't belong here. I'm not going. I can't survive here. And it wasn't a bad feeling. It was more of just this recognition about how powerful the ocean is, and about how small we are. And even on a 52-foot expedition class sailboat, we were very, very small.
Yeah.
And we were very, very vulnerable. And of course, I liked that because it's
exhilarating.
It's how I see the world, and it's how I choose to experience the world. But it was also very real that in a vehicle, you can hit the pause button, or even if you are moving around and you're solving problems, you're doing it in an environment that's totally natural for a human to do it in. Whereas if you're having to dive in to change out a prop, or if you're having to dive in and fix the rudder, or if you're having to dive in and do some other repair to the boat in the middle of the ocean, that's a very foreign place to be.
You're literally out of your element.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it gives you an appreciation for the different situations that you could be in. But when we dove in, it was a mirror. It was a mirror pond
gorgeous,
out there.
Gorgeous.
That was 16,000 feet of water.
Right.
Which is crazy to try to comprehend.
And I was trying to remember, we were close to 1,000 miles from Hawaii, and we were definitely 1,000 miles from Alaska and the shore of California.
Yeah, we were out there.
We were way out there. I mean, It was just about in the middle of, we were in that Pacific high.
Yeah. The only thing that I can, when overlanding, the only time I've ever really felt that same feeling of remoteness and kind of dependence on your vehicle is when you're crossing a desert. A lot of places that we overland, you've got, the temperatures, the terrain, you could hike out if you really needed to. You could walk, it might take you a couple of days to walk back to where you came from, but you could do it. Crossing deserts, even if it was just a couple of years ago, we went and did the Altar Desert down in Mexico, and you get to a point where you realize that if you needed to walk out, you're probably not going to make it.
It's too far.
It's too far. The conditions, you're gonna get exhausted trying to walk through the sand. The heat is going to get you before anything else. That was that same feeling that you get where you realize that vehicle is your lifeline, like a traveling sailboat would be your lifeline in the ocean.
That and any of the Arctic or the polar stuff is very similar.
Absolutely. When you're driving across the Greenland ice sheet, that's probably worse than the desert as far as your survivability.
True, and it's a rare situation. That was probably as close as I felt to that remoteness of being in the middle of the Pacific. So it's interesting comparing the two, because I did notice also on the boat that there were these daily inspections, which is something that I've learned is so important with vehicle-based overlanding, is that before you start your day, when you're still in camp, you check the vehicle out. You crawl underneath it, you go through your inspection, you check your fluids, you check your systems to make sure that everything is working properly before you head out for the day of travel. And it's amazing what you find when you do those daily inspections. And that's something that we did religiously on the boat. And we were so lucky to have Kevin Ryan along. Because
he's a wizard.
He is literally, for those that are listening, if you ever wanted to build an expedition sailboat, this is the guy to call. And what's the name of his business?
It's Outbound Yacht Services in Dana Point.
Yeah, I mean he's truly amazing at that whole process. I mean he impressed me not only as a mechanic and as an upfitter, but also as a traveling companion as well. Everybody on the trip was just wonderful, but it was really interesting to see how Kevin's mind worked in the same way that we have to solve problems with overland travel as well. So I thought the daily inspections were really important. And then we also had these weekly routines of going through and changing filters and checking on the desalinators. And so when you do a deeper dive into these systems that we rely on a day-to-day basis, the daily inspection is really just a quick check of all of the critical systems on the vehicle. But then you have these weekly checks where you're actually looking at the batteries, you're actually checking connections, you're actually pulling out the voltmeter and making sure that things are working properly on the vehicle. And you have a list of systems that you're going to go down and check, and that's what we had to do on the boat. And I found that was a great reminder of how that vigilance is so important when we get really remote. So I think that was a really good one.
It is. It's a form of preventative maintenance, and it really helps you to catch the problems before they get too big, if they're developing at all. But that brings back to the similarities. One of the things I've always found was a similarity between a sailboat and at least an expedition grade sailboat and an overland vehicle, they're, usually 12 volt system based. You have a confined amount of space. So the gear that you bring with you is limited. The amount of weight that you can bring with you is limited, because just as you don't want to overload an overlanding vehicle to optimize performance, you don't want to overload a sailboat to optimize performance.
Yeah, I remember when we left Long Beach. I mean, we were right at
we were pretty heavy.
the water line.
We had 5 guys with all the gear, including mountaineering gear, because to go play on land. So
and skis and
snowboards and surfboards, and
I think we had enough food for 4 years on that boat.
We had 3 months of dehydrated food for 5 people.
Right.
Which is a lot of food.
Yeah. Well, and that was just the dehydrated food. Plus we had all of the other food that we brought.
We had a lot of canned food. And, we had a lot. So
I'm not complaining, because we ate great. And once we started catching fish, then life got really, really good.
We were eating sushi every day.
It was amazing. It was so amazing.
But when planning for the electrical, even, because in the vehicle, it's kind of like when you're pulling into camp and you're calculating the amount, how big your battery should be, and what type of power you should have to run your fridge and maybe charge your computer and your cameras and all that. We had the same thing on the boat, because, when you're sailing, if the wind is good enough and the conditions are good enough, you're sailing just under sail. And we had a wind generator, and we had
that only gives, what was it, 8, 10, 12, 15 amps, something like that.
Yeah,
it wasn't much.
At the peak, it's about 15 amps. Yeah. So that's really good wind, and 20 knots of wind, you're getting that. We had a hydro generator, which was, I think those are really cool.
Yeah, 5, 6 amps. It wasn't much out of that either.
But that's one of the reasons we worked with battle-borne batteries.
Right.
And we put in a whole new battery bank into the boat in preparation for the demands that we were going to have. Because we were not only running all the electronics on the boat, radars, we had a satellite antenna. So we had constant internet access on the boat. Granted, it was low speed, but the power consumption overall demanded a new system. That's where the battle-borne batteries really shined.
Yeah, it seemed that the advantage of lithium for sailing is, again, there's more energy density for the same space, and then you've also gained the advantage of a lot less weight. So as I recall, you guys had about a 40% increase in the total available amperage, and you actually gained some space back on the boat. As I remember Kevin showing me the space, and it was just really optimized because of being able to move towards lithiums.
Yeah, we had more power with a smaller footprint.
Yeah, really impressive to see how that all worked. And we needed all of that because, again, 5 people charging devices, running all of the Garmin navigation systems that we had on the boat, which there were multiples of those. And we actually started playing. I remember we started playing around with, if you turn this on, if you turned on the water heater, the electric water heater, it'd start hammering 110 amps. Whereas if it was just the basic navigation of the boat with a lot of the screens turned off, we could get down to 12, 14, 15 amps total.
Yeah, you could take it down to a trickle.
Yeah, exactly. And that was really cool to see. And it, again, came back so much to the overland side of things as well. And that also brings this whole idea of the expedition sailing and the fact that crossing oceans feels a lot like crossing continents, and there are similarities and there are differences. One of the big benefits of the boat is you have a lot of hot water, so we could actually take that part of it was luxurious to take.
We had hot showers
very,
every day.
very comfortable showers, very comfortable sleeping, huge galley to prepare great food. So we all chipped in to make these great meals, and we were catching fish, which is, again, we're not typically able to collect game when we're on land, overlanding, whereas when you're out in the sailboat, you're taking this amazing bounty from the ocean.
Well, there are people who they incorporate some form of hunting or fishing into their overlanding.
They do, but it's just less common.
You have to stop to do it.
Right.
Yeah, where
true.
we were trolling a couple of lines the entire time,
and
every couple of days you'd get the gift of a tuna.
It was incredible.
And
Yeah,
you never had to stop to really deal with it.
Yeah, bluefin today, yellowfin tomorrow.
That was great.
Then you guys ended up, I stepped off in Dutch Harbor, which incidentally happens to be where they filmed the Deadliest Catch and these other shows. And we made it to the Bering Sea, and then you guys continued on. And talk a little bit about what were some of the highlights of cruising along the Aleutians.
Yeah, so the Aleutians I think it's a very unique place on the planet. If you were to look at a map, a lot of people don't know the Aleutians by the name, but if you were to look at a map of and see a picture of Alaska, it's got that sweeping tail that goes off to the west. That sweeping tail is the Aleutian Island chain, and it goes out, I want to say 800 miles from the 800 or 1,000 miles from the Alaskan Peninsula. So from Prince William Sound, you're out another, call it 1,000 miles to Attu Island. Attu Island is the last island in the Aleutian chain that's part of the United States. So,
and it's on the other side of the international date line, right?
It is. So it has two geographic significant qualities. At one time, it's the furthest west point in the United States, and at the same time, it's the furthest easternmost point in the United States in the other hemisphere.
Sure.
So it's got those two things about it.
On the other side of the date line. And then so that makes Alaska the furthest north, the furthest east, and the furthest west.
Right.
Interesting.
And so we crossed the international date line twice going there.
Yeah.
Which was pretty neat. And it was interesting to see the different mapping programs and everything. And I remember we were all running Garmin inReaches. And when we got to the international date line, we fell off the edge of the earth.
Yeah.
Because the Garmin map stopped.
Well, because it's flat, right?
Because, yeah, that's when you sail, you learn that the earth is flat. and so, even though we actually took the Great Circle route to get up to the Bering Sea, which in itself is a pretty amazing calculation of navigation.
Right.
So it proves that going in an arc is faster and shorter than going in a straight line.
Oh, interesting. Sure.
So we navigated by the Great Circle route, but yeah, and with the Garmin piece, you fell off the map and you had to scroll all the way back east past Russia to see yourself.
To get back on the map.
To get back on the map. So I thought that was interesting. But
well, you got to the other side of the flat Earth when you did that.
Right, you just turned the page. Turn the page over.
Amazing.
So the other significance of Attu Island is that it was during World War II, it was invaded by the Japanese, and it was actually
occupied
by the Japanese. And so there was a war that now kind of referred to as the Silent War, or I think the Forgotten War. And so there was a war being fought in the Aleutian Islands during World War II that at the time that it was happening, the U.S. government denied that it was happening.
Got it.
But then after, it only took about 2 months, and then they kind of said, yeah, here's what's going on. But it was pretty devastating to the Aleutians in the sense that a lot of the native population that lived in the Aleutian Islands was taken away.
Some POW camps.
Yeah, they were taken to POW camps in Japan, and then others were evacuated to the United States, but that wasn't really, or the United States mainland. But that really wasn't any better because the living conditions that they were put in were they were just very poor.
Impossible, sure.
Yeah, very, very impossible. So, some people got to move back, but, right now Attu is uninhabited. There's a small naval base, or it's more like a U.S. Coast Guard base in Massacre Bay that was abandoned in 2010. And so we got to see that firsthand, and that was quite bizarre.
So cool.
And then we got to explore the island quite a bit. We'd go for hikes every day that we were there, and then we went around the corner to a bay called Holtz Bay, which is really, it's got to be one of the most spectacular anchorages I've ever been in. It's a wonderful holding bottom, kind of a muddy clay. So it's great for anchoring. And then you're surrounded on three sides by these wonderful big mountains with snow at the top. And there's one of the things out there is it's foggy every day. And, if it's not foggy, you wait about 30 minutes and it's foggy. And then you wait another 30 minutes and the fog goes away, and then it's just cycles. And so Holt's Bay is where we went skiing. And so you could look up in the mountains and there's snow everywhere. And we were late, really, really late in the season for it, but we were able to find a couple of couloirs that still had snow in them. And we were able to hike up and get some turns in. And, so it's August. August skiing on Attu Island in the middle of the Aleutians, or at the end of the Aleutians. So,
and I remember you telling me a story that you went down below and you come back up top, and a couple of the guys on the boat, they've got all their ice axes and they got all their crampons and everything, and they're getting into the dinghy to go climb up an iceberg.
Yeah.
And then what changed their mind?
So this was out in front of the Columbia Glacier. And the Columbia Glacier is the fastest moving glacier, at least in the United States, possibly in the world. I'm not sure about that. But that's over in Prince William Sound. So you got to think that by the time we get to this point in the trip, we were all very comfortable with risk.
Sure.
We were getting towards the end of the trip. We were getting closer to
2 months almost, right?
Yeah, about 2 months of a trip. And we were getting closer to populated areas. We were getting closer to the end of the trip. So the risk factor was going down, because when you're out in the Aleutians, you're completely on your own. Where we were at the Columbia Glacier, you could be in Valdez in a day. And so I came up on deck. I went down to we were going to do a drone flight. So I went down to get the drone ready, and I came up, and a couple of guys had life jackets and ice axes in their hands, and they were holding their crampons, because they were going to put the crampons on their boots in a minute, and they were lowering the dinghy, and they were 3 minutes away from kind of going off towards this iceberg that was floating. And mind you, these are really bad ideas. Like, this is stuff that you just don't do. You really,
Well, if you survive them, they're great ideas.
They're great ideas. What a cool picture, right? But they're really bad ideas. And so as they were about to step into the dinghy, this 15-foot section of this iceberg just calved off and crashed into the water, and it sounded like thunder, and it sent a wave towards the boat. And these guys, they couldn't get their life jackets off fast enough. And they're like, okay, we're not doing that.
Change of plan.
Change of plan. Oh. But when we were up there, we'd see whales.
It was incredible.
2 or 3 different types of whales.
Killer whales, yeah.
Yeah, we saw it. We got not intentionally close, but just based on the trajectories of where we were both going, the boat was on one course, and we looked off to the left, and there were 3 killer whales. I'm assuming that it was a set of parents and a baby, and you could see the baby was this tiny little killer whale, and then there was a kind of a medium-sized orca next to it, and then there was a big orca kind of flanking them, moving around and kind of guarding. And we just kind of started to converge naturally, and we probably got about 50 yards away from one another. And then the biggest orca, which we kind of assumed that his dad, maybe it was mom, I don't know much about killer whales, but the tail went up, and it just went smack, smack, smack on the water. And we all of us were like, okay, we need to leave. Like, it was this clear warning that we were too close.
Yeah.
And so they went in the other direction, and we went in the other direction. But that was a pretty neat encounter. And so there's birds everywhere.
Yeah.
Constant, surrounded by birds the entire time. A lot of whales feeding, and then a lot of good fishing. We were in an anchorage, and we had set anchor. We were only there for 20 minutes or so, and Rusty had thrown out a lure on a rod. It was just a little jig. It looked like a crappie jig, something that you'd kind of get panfish with. And he hooked into something, and it just wouldn't stop pulling. And we'd get it a little bit closer, and then it would run. And we were like, this thing is pretty big. We don't know what it is. And we got it up, and he was trying to figure out like where the fish was, because we saw something in the water, but he didn't look like a fish. We were expecting this little panfish or something. We pulled up a 125-pound halibut.
Wow.
And it was so big that we had to put it in the dinghy to clean it, because we couldn't get it up. We couldn't bring it up on the boat. It was so big. And so it was about 125 pounds. We got about 80 pounds of fish.
Incredible.
80 pounds of meat off of that fish, and we ate it for a month.
Yeah.
We still had some left over at the end of the trip, and then not only that, but we started trading it along the way because we couldn't catch salmon very well. But we had all this halibut, and we'd trade the salmon fishermen for halibut.
Hey, that's what it comes down to.
Yeah,
right?
it's great.
Nothing wrong with bartering.
Yeah.
So looking back at 2 months on crossing the Pacific, and of course the goal is to stage the boat and then move up through the Bering Sea, through the Bering Strait and into the Northwest Passage and hopefully cross over the top of Canada. But at this point in the journey, what were some of your key takeaways from that? What were the things that you really learned, maybe that surprised you, things that relate to overlanding that you think are really important mindsets to have?
Yeah. I think the thing that stands out to all of us, the five of us that were involved, including yourself, was the team. We never had any arguments. We never had any blow-ups. We never had any emotional breakdowns. Mm-hmm. It doesn't mean that every day was, sunshine and unicorns, but, we never had any issues.
Sure.
At least personal issues with 5 people living in close confined quarters. And so everybody was on their game. Everybody was, part of the objective. And everybody really was interested in working together as a team. And I think that was a really big takeaway. And because whether you're doing an expedition on land or on ice or in a desert or, through the forest, that teamwork is critical. And for an overlanding trip, it becomes even more critical because you've got usually multiple vehicles. That usually involves multiple ownership of different vehicles, trying to get everybody with the same objective, right? On a boat, you've got the same objective because you're all going the same place.
That's right.
Right? You get 3
Unless you mutiny, right? I guess that's what happened hundreds of years ago. People are like, actually, that island over there looks really good right now.
But on an expedition with 3 or 4 trucks, if somebody wants to, just leave one day and go drive the other direction, they can. And that creates a lot of, that becomes an issue depending on where you're at and what you're doing. So the people involved, I think, is pretty critical. And also learning to be that close to other people for that amount of time. And, just be cool about everything and be...
Yeah, and give people space and start to learn what makes them feel a little bit better. If you can tell that they're off a little bit. We always were checking in on each other. We did weekly med checks as well, which I think was really important. But, when Josh would make some insane elk sausage burrito and hand it up to you into the cockpit while you're on watch,
all your worries went away.
Yeah, it was literally like magic. And everybody was mindful in that way. Rusty would make fresh bread or Kevin would handle something on the boat that made life that much easier, and everybody was really mindful. And I think that was one of the takeaways that I had was if you take care of the boat and if you take care of each other, your chances of success are very high. And that certainly applies to overlanding as much as it does
to direct carryover. Absolutely.
Sailing for sure. So one of the things that I love to ask on these podcasts, and I have 1,000 more questions that I should be asking you even about your overland trips, but one of the things that I love to ask is kind of what your top couple books that you have read in the last couple decades that really stood out to you, something even recently that you've read.
Yeah, I'm not a good answer for that question. And, as much as I should read, I'm not a big reader.
That's okay too.
Yeah. For example, I think everybody else on this past trip that we just got done doing, you were on the boat for a month, and I think
I was voracious.
You read a dozen books?
5 printed books and 3 audiobooks.
Okay. Yeah. And I read 1.5 books in 2 months, and everybody else was in that 8 to 10 or plus range. And so I don't read a lot. I tend to consume written material in smaller chunks, right?
But I do remember on the boat, to your defense, that when we were getting closer to the islands, or if there was something that we needed to prepare for, like we were doing some training to prepare us for bad weather, you were deep into the books about how to do that. So it seems like that the nonfiction technical volumes have a lot of appeal to you.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I like for sailing and even for overlanding, it's, there's certain books that you can turn to that they've got all the answers, and you can go in, get what you need, and then get out. But you're not necessarily reading a book for a week. So I've got a whole collection of marine, sailing expedition books, a lot of Chapman type stuff, who's an author, and a number of others they're very specific, right? It's about, I have the weather book, and I have the anchoring book.
The anchoring book is insane.
Yeah.
It was a giant book about anchoring.
Yeah. It's got to be 2 inches thick.
It's massive.
It's all about how to anchor.
Yeah. It was so cool.
Most people think you just throw the anchor over.
Yeah.
It's far from the truth. We were on Kiska Island, and we were anchored there, and we had just gotten in, and we were getting ready to go to shore, and we were going to go. There were 2 ponds that we were going to go fish, these ponds for salmon, and the weather turned, and all of a sudden we've got, I think it was, the weather turned, and we just kind of hunkered down, so we decided not to go ashore, and then we only had a single anchor down, and then we woke up about 2:30 in the morning, and it was blowing 40 knots, and the anchor was dragging, and so we spent. We all got right on it, and we all knew what to do, and we rigged a second anchor, which now stays rigged all the time. And we had meant to have it rigged all the time, but we just hadn't gotten to it yet. So no better time, 2:30 in the morning in the dark with sideways rain that literally stung face. And so we rigged the second anchor, we put the second anchor out, and then we had anchor watch for the rest of the day for the next 12 hours or so. But it's those little skills that you learn by reading those books, and so I like to dive in to a book, get what I want and need out of it, and then
do it
and get on with it. Right. So I don't sit around and read novels.
No, it's okay. Yeah. No,
but there's a lot of value to that. I always wish that I, would read more, and I just never quite do.
I know you went and sailed the Caribbean for years, right? So
yeah.
One of the things that I always really like to ask in this podcast is what kind of advice what would be the number one piece of advice that you would give someone that was looking at going and doing cruise sailing or living on a sailboat or looking to travel around the world in a vehicle? What would you tell them?
I think that the most immediate thing that comes to mind is to make the decision to go, and then go. And don't get hung up on everything that's going to hold you back. And it's really easy to do because, adult life has a lot of different things that it throws at you. But if you can make the decision to go, and that allows yourself, so you've made the decision, now you can start the planning. And I think a critical part of the planning is training. We all know how to drive a vehicle. Or most people know how to drive a vehicle.
That's saying a lot.
Yeah. We're all the best driver in the world, right? And so a lot of people know how to drive a vehicle in the sense of, they can make it go straight down the road maybe. Yeah. But you want to get some training on, how do you drive a 4-wheel drive vehicle properly, on the trail and deal with adverse conditions. And then that's just going to keep you safer. Going to preserve the vehicle, and it's going to allow you to travel further. So similarly, and maybe a little bit more important, is learning how to sail, because we've all grown up in cars or trucks being driven. You grew up watching your parents drive the vehicle, right? And it kind of comes pretty intuitively. It's not the same for a sailboat, and the sailboat has a little bit riskier consequences for messing up. And so, take a sailing class. I'd suggest, if you can, try to learn how to sail dinghies before you worry about sailing bigger boats. The dinghies are going to teach you a lot more, a lot faster, because they're much more responsive. Everything you do on a dinghy has an immediate reaction. And so, you learn how to manage a boat much more efficiently if you start learning on dinghies. And then from there, you learn about big boats, and the big boats tend to have, more systems, and they're also more powerful. So there's certain things you have to be careful of there. And so, kind of graduate into a bigger boat. There's lots of classes available for kids. So there's junior sailing programs all over the country. And there's lots of adult sailing programs around the country as well. And as an example, there's lots of great benefits in being part of an adult sailing program, and
sure,
get to meet somebody as amazing as my wife. And so there's really good things about those, and you can find them in Colorado, you can find them on the coast, you can find them in Chicago. They're really all over the country, whether it's through a club or a yacht club. There's even a sailing program in Phoenix, Arizona, which is the middle of the desert.
Right.
And so lots of opportunities to learn. And then from there, if you're to buy a sailboat, it's like approach it the same way that if you were to properly approach buying an overland vehicle. Figure out where you intend to go, the type of sailing that you intend to do. And then there's different boats that are going to provide a better solution for the different environments that you plan to be in. If you're going to go into the Arctic, you're talking about high latitude sailing, and the conditions are much different than if you're going to go to the Caribbean. And they're different than if you were to go sail on the coast in Texas or off the coast of San Diego. All those different areas are going to have different demands on a sailboat. And, you can spend $5,000 on a sailboat that you're going to have a ton of fun with, and it could take you out to Catalina Island off the coast of California and back and forth, and you could have a wonderful time. Or you could throw it on a trailer and, take it down to the Sea of Cortez, or you could take it to your local lake and go sailing and have fun.
Yeah.
And so,
You're right. When you think about it compared to vehicles, you could take a clapped out sedan and somehow get your way around the world.
Sure.
If you leave with too small of a sailboat without the basic safety features and you try to sail around the world, it's probably going to be a very different outcome. So that is very true. And I remember, actually, as you were saying about the training, I remembered one of the first times that I talked to you about sailing. You're like, yeah, you should go do this sailing class. And I said, I want to just get on a boat and I just want to go do it. That's how I'm going to learn. I'm just going to go do it. And I remember you laughing at me just like you are now. Right. And I'm so glad I got training.
Yeah, and it didn't take much, right?
No.
You took a basic U.S. sailing's
Right.
adult sailing class. It was
I did. The Colgate School, I think, is what it was.
Yeah, and it was maybe a weekend.
Yeah. It was a long weekend, because we went all the way up to bareboat. So
yeah, and you had some book work to go along with
Right.
it, you know. But it was an introductory sailing class, and then you had the opportunity to go on a trip.
Yep.
But granted, there's not a lot of people who get to go on a Pacific crossing.
Sure.
And so you got.
Yeah, I feel very fortunate.
Well, you got years and years of the typical sailing experience condensed into a month, and so it helped a lot. Your skill level advanced very quickly, right? And so, you can still achieve, a level of competency to be able to go and either charter a boat, say from the moorings or another charter boat company, down in the Caribbean and the Virgin Islands, even off the coast of California. There's lots of charter boat companies that you really don't need a whole lot of experience to charter a boat. You need to have a credit card, and then they'll pretty much give you the boat.
Sure.
But for your own safety, you want to have adequate training to be able to manage yourself.
Sometimes those systems stop working, and then you need to be able to have a chart.
Yeah.
And you need to be able to use a compass to navigate.
Not only that, but I think the biggest differentiator between overlanding in a vehicle and exploring by a sailboat is the weather. So your overland vehicle, it really isn't dependent on the weather. You can drive it through a rainstorm. You can kind of go where you want.
Or maybe just park it under a cover.
It, right? You could stop. You could park it, and you'll be just fine. Everything about sailing is contingent upon the weather. So, every piece of the weather, whether it's the wind speed, the waves, the height of the waves.
Yeah, the sea state, all that.
Yeah, the sea state. I mean, the duration between waves, currents, tides, all these things that you take for granted on land are going to influence a sailboat. And they're going to influence your travel schedule as well.
And I think that's why I really enjoyed sailing so much. Was it's like overlanding, but way harder.
Yeah.
And also oddly more comfortable with better food sometimes. So it's really an interesting thing to consider for those that are listening. Please check out Kailani Expedition on Instagram. You can see a little bit more about what Brian and I did, and fortunately, Rusty Franz was so generous to bring us along, and we had a great crew of Josh and Kevin as well. So check out that adventure. Where else can people find more about you and your travels, Brian?
Sure. So, well, certainly through expeditionportal.com and Overland Journal. And then on Instagram, it's at McVickers. On Facebook, I think it's just Brian McVickers. And then for this most recent trip, as Scott mentioned, it's at Kailani Expedition on Instagram. And then their website is kailanivoyage.com.
Yeah, it was an amazing journey, Brian, and thank you so much for recommending that I go. It was a life-changing experience. I had my lowest resting heart rate that I had ever recorded on that trip. So it really, I found immense stillness in the chaos of the seas, and it really was a transformative experience for me. And I cannot thank you enough for you and Rusty as well for providing me with that opportunity to go. And for those that are listening, as Brian said, don't sit in the marina. Get in your vehicle or get on your boat and go see the world. And we will talk to you next time.